This is Today as It Happened. Good Monday evening to you. I'm Holly Furfer, here with your chronological look at the biggest events and stories of the day. From day 6 of the federal government shutdown to peace talks in Egypt between Israel and Hamas. But first, this morning, we took a look at developments in President Donald Trump's efforts to deploy the National Guard in Portland. A federal judge temporarily blocked California National Guard troops from deploying to Portland. This comes a day after the same judge blocked Oregon's National Guard deployment. President Trump ordered the troops to what he calls a war-ravaged city to protect ICE agents. About 100 California troops had already arrived. Oregon's governor says Trump is trying to sidestep Saturday's court ruling. Texas has also been ordered to send 400 National Guard members to Portland. Scripps News Deputy Political Director Joe St. George joins us now live from Capitol Hill with more on all of this. All right, let's start with the deployment of these National Guard troops. Is this the issue really about crime and safety? Is this about the president sort of demonstrating his power over democratic cities? And is he still sending troops even though the court said stop?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, right? And usually you don't think of the courts as being active over the weekend, but it certainly was. In fact, there was a 10 p.m. hearing last night involving this order from the Trump administration to try and send National Guard's troops from California and Texas to the state of Oregon. We should know that it's not necessarily a new policy from the President of the United States, right? He's previously sent the National Guard to Washington, D.C. to help clean up crime. He sent the National Guard to Los Angeles to protect federal agencies and federal law enforcement. Remember, D.C. was always different because D.C.'s not your typical city. It's not a state, right? So the president has more authority, more leeway in D.C. that he doesn't have, let's say, in a typical city like Portland, Oregon. But President Trump's frustration with Portland goes back years and years and years and years. He used to criticize how he felt parts of the city were allowed to be occupied. The president is obviously of one political persuasion. Portland is famously known for being the exact opposite of that persuasion in many cases. Although Oregon can be conservative in many different parts of the state, particularly rural parts of Oregon. The reality is, though, Portland officials, Oregon officials, did not want the National Guard to come. Very similar to what we saw in California earlier this year, in which Los Angeles mayor and the governor of California did not want the National Guard to come. But the president of the United States is clearly pushing the limits of presidential power, clearly testing the limits of what does it mean to be commander-in-chief, testing the limits of existing federal laws regarding what active military can and can't do, and quite frankly could be setting up a clash with the Supreme Court to provide a little finality to this question of how can the National Guard be used, when can the National Guard be used, and what is exactly the president's order in all of this. To get you caught up, the president initially tried to send members of the military to Portland. That was rejected by a federal judge in a decision. And then the attempted to federalize the Oregon National Guard to protect Oregon. That was rejected. Then the president tried to basically call up the California National Guard, the Texas National Guard, for the exact same reason, to go to Oregon, to go to Portland, to protect the city. War-ravaged Portland is what the president often refers to it on social media. But the president lost in court, at least for now. Governor Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, posting on X late last night. This is a late Sunday night hearing. Quote, breaking, we just won in court again. A federal judge blocked Donald Trump's unlawful attempt to deploy 300 of our National Guard troops to Portland. The court granted our request for a temporary restraining order halting any federalization, relocation, or deployment of any Guard members to Oregon from any state here. But as we've seen before, the president likes to appeal. The White House doesn't believe any facts on the grounds have changed. They feel like they're in the right. Portland officials feel like they're in the right. Look for this legal battle to continue, Holly.
Scripps News Deputy Political Director Joe St. George for us. Thank you, Joe. We'll see you in a little bit. Former NFL quarterback Mark Sanchez stabbed multiple times during a late-night altercation in downtown Indianapolis on Saturday. Police say the Fox Sports analyst who was in town to call Sunday's Raiders-Colts game smelled of alcohol and confronted a 69-year-old truck driver in an alley. Hotel video shows Sanchez accosted the driver at a loading dock. The driver then pulled a knife in self-defense when he says he feared for his life. Sanchez was hospitalized in stable condition with stab wounds to his upper torso. He faces charges including battery, unauthorized entry, and public intoxication. And explosions and smoke filled the Gaza Strip Monday as Israel continued its offensive campaign while peace talks began in Egypt. The negotiations come on the eve of the second anniversary of the Israel-Hamas war. Israeli negotiator Ron Dermer and Hamas leader Khalil al-Hayya are meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh. The talks focus on a ceasefire, partial Israeli withdrawal, and exchanging hostages for Palestinian prisoners. Hamas has accepted some elements of President Trump's peace plan. About 48 hostages do remain, with roughly 20 believed to be alive. Scripps News international correspondent Blake Sifton is in Tel Aviv for us. And Blake, what's the feeling on the ground in Israel over these talks and where they could possibly lead?
Good morning, Holly. As these indirect talks in Egypt look set to get underway in the next few hours, there is a great deal of hope, both here in Israel as well as in Gaza. But I think understandably, also people are quite nervous. There's been two ceasefires now that have broken down. And of course, there's been almost countless efforts, negotiations to reach ceasefires that have evaporated at the last minute. Now, just to bring you some updates on the process, the Israeli delegation, we understand, has just arrived in the last little while. The Hamas delegation arrived last night. They are led by Khalil al-Hayya. He is their chief negotiator, and he survived that Israeli airstrike on the Hamas negotiating team in Doha, Qatar, in an attack that killed his son. Of course, from the U.S. side, we expect U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, as well as Jared Kushner to attend these talks, as well as Qatar's foreign minister. And the talks themselves, these initial talks, will focus on the logistics of the ceasefire, which is the first thing, the cessation of hostilities, the first thing that needs to happen before anything else goes forth, but also on where Israeli forces will withdraw to during the hostage and prisoner exchange, and crucially, which Palestinian prisoners will be exchanged for the Israeli hostages.
And Blake, President Trump has expressed a lot of optimism for these talks. So what do you think the likelihood of a breakthrough coming quickly is?
That's right. Despite President Trump's optimism and enthusiasm, there are many large obstacles that need to be overcome. To begin with, Hamas is meant to, according to this deal, release all 48 Israeli hostages within 72 hours of this deal being signed. However, Hamas have reportedly told mediators that is unrealistic, that it will take them longer than 72 hours to retrieve all of the bodies of the deceased hostages because, according to them, some are buried under rubble. And of course, Israel has agreed to release 250 so-called security prisoners. These are Palestinian prisoners serving life sentences in Israeli jails. And Hamas reportedly want high-profile prisoners released. These are the kind of prisoners that Israel believes are the most notorious and the most reluctant for them to release. The top of that list is Marwan Barghouti. He is a leader from Fatah. He was jailed in 2002, accused of several killings during the Second Intifada. He is commonly referred to as the Nelson Mandela of Palestine because people believe that if he were freed, when he leaves jail, he would automatically become a popular leader, be able to unite the Palestinian people, and likely be a successor to President Mahmoud Abbas. There's also the Hamas commander in the West Bank during the Second Intifada, as well as the Secretary General of a smaller militant faction in the West Bank and Gaza called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Hamas have pushed for these men to be released in the past. However, now that this is their last opportunity with their last batch of hostages, they are expected to dig their heels in on this issue. In addition, another major question is where Israeli forces will withdraw to during the prisoner and hostage exchange. According to the proposal, the Israeli forces will only carry out a modest withdrawal, and they will withdraw to where they were in August, but that would leave them still in control of major Palestinian population centers, and Hamas is pushing for them to withdraw withdraw to where they were in January, which would be outside of those areas. In addition, the long-term Israeli withdrawal, the full withdrawal from Gaza, is the major question because that is tied to the progress of this international stabilization force and is open-ended and vague, and Hamas are demanding timetables and maps and clarity on this issue. And of course, the major issue must be overcome is Hamas disarming. Hamas did not mention their disarmament when they replied to President Trump and his 20-point peace proposal. And of course, in addition to the release of the Israeli hostages, Hamas disarming and Gaza being demilitarized is Israel's other major demand.
Seems like there's still a lot of work ahead. Scripps News international correspondent Blake Sifton in Tel Aviv, thank you for that update. Coming up on Today As It Happened, protests roiled Chicago and Portland over the weekend amid a federal crackdown on immigration. So stay with us for Scripps News investigative correspondent Patrick Terpstra's reporting as President Donald Trump continues to clash with blue states over law enforcement. For the break. Welcome back to Today As It Happened. All right, let's check back in on our daily briefing of today's top stories. The Supreme Court today rejected an appeal from Ghislaine Maxwell, the former girlfriend of Jeffrey Epstein, who's serving 20 years in prison for sex trafficking. Maxwell's lawyers argued she never should have been tried because of a 2007 non-prosecution agreement with Epstein, also protected his co-conspirators. The justices offered no explanation for turning away the case. Maxwell was convicted of luring teenage girls to be sexually abused by Epstein in the 1990s and early 2000s. Epstein died by suicide in jail in 2019 while awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. Investigators in South Carolina are looking into a fire at a state circuit judge's house. It left 3 people injured. Crews had to use kayaks to rescue the people inside the house due to its remote location. Circuit Court Judge Diane Goodstein and her husband, former state Senator Arnold Goodstein, own the Edisto Beach home. France is in political crisis after Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu resigned. He held the job for less than a month. Lecornu made the announcement today, just hours after unveiling his new cabinet. He blamed endless party divisions and egos in Parliament for his departure. Both the left and right criticized his cabinet as a betrayal of his promise for change. Political scientists say President Macron must now decide whether to dissolve Parliament or call for new presidential elections. Angry clashes in Portland, Oregon between protesters and law enforcement. This happened near an Immigration and Customs facility overnight, all stemming from President Trump's decision to deploy National Guard troops to Oregon. The president called Portland a, quote, war zone. Federal agents also aggressively pushed back protesters in Chicago this past weekend. Scripps News investigative correspondent Patrick Terpstra following all of the developments for us in Washington. And Patrick, the clash between the Trump administration and these cities are playing out both on the ground and in court, and it's been quite shocking.
It has, and you really have two sides here. You've got the protesters in these Democratic blue cities versus these federal agents under command of President Trump and his administration. And over the weekend, we saw some pretty heated confrontations. This was in Portland. And Holly, there are claims that tear gas has been used as well as smoke grenades. Very aggressive tactics here by both the agents on the scene, but the agents saying that the protesters have been more aggressive, pointing to an incident that happened in Chicago on Saturday where they say that one of the protesters tried to ram agents and that woman was shot. She was shot and injured, drove herself to a hospital where she was treated and is now in FBI custody, charged with trying to harm those federal agents. As that case plays out, the Illinois governor, J.B. Pritzker, saying that the federal government is actually making things worse, talking about a plan to deploy 700 National Guard to Chicago to address some of the protests there. Pritzker saying that it is not necessary and pointing to those smoke grenades and tear gas being used, saying that it is making things worse. This was the governor over the weekend.
What Trump is doing is untethered from the facts. That's the case. He was claiming that it's mayhem on the on the streets of Portland. He's saying that, Chicago is a war zone. None of that is true. They're just making this up.
And a short time ago, we actually heard from the mayor of Chicago making some news this morning, talking about further trying to restrict the movements of federal agents. Not entirely clear how that would work out, but he has signed an executive order, essentially creating what he calls ICE-free zones. This was the mayor a little while ago.
The order establishes ICE-free zones. That means that city property and unwilling private businesses will no longer serve as staging grounds for these raids.
Making very clear that the idea is that if there are private businesses that don't want to have ICE agents, and if there are certain city properties that don't want to have ICE agents, they will try to refuse entry. But again, how does that work? Apparently, the city's saying that they will file a lawsuit to try to block the movement of those federal agents, but really unprecedented things happening when you talk about trying to restrict the movement of federal agents. At the same time, across the country in Portland, Oregon, the governor there, also a Democrat, she is fighting a plan to deploy hundreds of National Guard troops in Portland, Oregon, another liberal Democratic stronghold. That includes troops that would also be coming from Texas and California. The governor of California, Gavin Newsom, taking to social media over the weekend saying that all of this amounts to essentially martial law. So that is all playing out in the courts. There is that social media post saying that it is a breathtaking abuse of the law and power by the President of the United States. As far as the President of the United States goes, Donald Trump, he is saying that he is trying to fight crime in these cities. This was the president talking to reporters over the weekend.
When you can have 40 or 50 people killed over the last couple of months, hundreds of people wounded, there's no place like that in the world. Hundreds of people wounded, 50, 55 people shot and killed. And Pritzker gets up and says, what a wonderful place it is. They need help.
And the president, of course, has long talked about trying to bring down crime in a lot of these cities, especially Chicago and Portland, where all of this is now playing out. A federal judge in Portland ruled against the Trump administration from being able to deploy those members of the National Guard. The Trump administration has appealed to the Ninth Circuit. We are waiting to see what happens with that, Holly.
All right, Scripps News investigative correspondent Patrick Terpstra live for us. Thank you for that update. Up next on Today As It Happened, the Supreme Court starts its new term today with high-stakes cases that could reshape American law. That's after the break. You're watching Today As It Happened, Scripps News rundown of the biggest events and stories of the day. So let's jump right in. The CDC is pulling broad support for COVID-19 shots. The agency now says the vaccine should only be given through shared decision-making with a healthcare provider. The change comes from recommendations by Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s hand-picked vaccine advisory panel. The CDC also changed its recommendation for the measles, mumps, rubella, varicella vaccine for children under 4. It's the first day of the new Supreme Court term, and the High Court has several high-profile cases on the docket. The justices will tackle President Trump's assertion of executive power, along with voting rights and LGBTQ+ issues. And Deputy Political Director Joe St. George has all the details.
The federal government remains shut down, but the courts remain open, and that means the highest court in the land, the U.S. Supreme Court, will begin another term today that is expected to be historic and potentially drastically impact the presidency of Donald Trump. If you are wondering how the federal courts are operating during a shutdown, this memo from the federal judiciary explains it. The judiciary remains open and will continue paid operations through Friday, October 17th by using court fee balances and other funds not dependent on a new appropriation. That means this week's oral arguments at the Supreme Court, the first of this term, are proceeding as planned. The High Court will take on dozens of issues this year, but it just may be defined by its decisions regarding President Donald Trump. It will hear arguments regarding tariffs and whether the president has the ability, as he believes he does, to issue them without Congress. It will also take on the issue of recent firings or attempted firings of leaders within agencies like the Federal Reserve. President Trump wants current Board of Governor Lisa Cook fired. The Supreme Court will decide if he can do it. The Supreme Court is also poised to decide whether President Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship runs afoul of the 14th Amendment. In the months to come, of course, the Supreme Court will address other issues as well, including likely transgender rights cases and sports bans in some states. It will also examine whether Hawaii's ban on firearms in many public places is a violation of the Second Amendment. Now, it will be several weeks in many cases for some of the most high-profile cases to be heard by the Supreme Court. And, of course, the most consequential decisions don't come out until next year.
Coming up on Today As It Happened.
Someone has to look at the balance sheet and be good stewards of the American taxpayer dollar. And layoffs are an unfortunate consequence of that.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer, here with your daily rundown of today's top stories.
The Senate reconvenes this hour on this Monday ahead of a 5:30 p.m. Eastern vote on a short-term funding measure. Both parties are poised, though, to not really get much done here. Here's the deal. They have to get something done because Americans are feeling frustrated. A significant majority, 70% of those polled, say they oppose the government shutdown. And while more Americans blame the Republicans for the shutdown, look at this poll. It says that it's only 53% compared to 47%. So pretty slim margins there. Scripps News congressional correspondent Nathaniel Reed is live on Capitol Hill with the latest developments here. I know we're going to be playing that game, Nate, where we watch the Senate floor and see who we can see talking to each other off camera. But another finding in that poll, 3 in 5 Americans think the Republicans will come out on top in this shutdown showdown. That being said, any possibility we could see some kind of miracle this afternoon?
Well, I mean, what's the saying? 5th time's the charm? Actually, nobody says that, and that's because I don't think there's any belief up here on Capitol Hill that the 5th time trying to pass this funding bill is going to look any different than the 4th, 3rd time, 2nd time, 1st time that they tried to get it across the finish line. Now, the momentum did move slightly in the Republicans' direction when this shutdown began last week, but no other Democrats have voted in favor of this government funding plan. They would need about 5 additional votes, more than what they're getting right now, to reopen the government, to end this shutdown, to move on to the next battle, so to speak. But look, Democrats are as dug in as ever on their demands for health care, an extension to these Affordable Care Act tax credits, which expire at the end of the year. Otherwise, Americans could be facing some seriously high price hikes for their medical premiums if you get your insurance through your state's exchange or marketplace. Obviously, this is something that Democrats have tried to take a laser focus on. The question is whether anyone will move in their direction or they will have to move in Republicans' direction. Now, we did learn actually a little bit new this afternoon from the White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, who told us that President Trump is in direct communication with House Speaker Mike Johnson. Johnson, again, has remained firm here that House Republicans have nothing that they can do to reach an agreement here, that the House has done its work. It's on the Senate to act. That being said, we also learned from Carolyn Leavitt that President Trump is looking for moderate Democrats to possibly fill in the gaps here to avert this current government shutdown, to take the U.S. out of a shutdown. A lot of questions about what which Democrats, Republicans could rely on switching their vote, especially as Democratic leadership looks to dig in on this health care issue. Take a listen.
Is the president calling Democratic senators himself? Can you say what he's doing today to resolve the shutdown?
Yep, I was just in the Oval Office. He was on the phone with Speaker Johnson. He's also spoken with the Senate Majority Leader, who are in touch with, of course, moderate Democrats and Democrats across the board, who we understand hopefully want to do the right thing by their constituents to reopen the government. So the president is being kept very well apprised of the ongoing shutdown on Capitol Hill. And of course, his position is very clear. There's nothing to negotiate, just reopen the government, and then we can talk about all the important issues facing our country.
So Senate Majority Leader John Thune in touch with moderate Democrats. Again, no word on if any would be willing to switch to the Republican position any more than already have. So far, 3 Democrats are reliably voting with Republicans to try and reopen the government. That being said, about 5 more would be needed to actually get the U.S. out of a shutdown. A lot of questions about whether the momentum will continue to move in Republicans' direction, if they feel like this is something where they can get Democrats, try and pick them off one by one, try and get more Democrats to their column. Again, President Trump apparently seems hopeful. A lot of questions, though, about the reality up here on Capitol Hill, whether Democrats feel like they have that messaging upper hand, especially a year out from the midterm elections in 2026.
Yeah, so many people looking ahead to the midterms. Let's play a hypothetical here. Let's say let's say the Republicans get Democrats to come over and vote to approve this short-term spending plan to open negotiations while reopening the government. The House is out again this week. So then what? If there's a change to this, to a compromise to end the shutdown, the House is closed, then what?
Well, bipartisan compromise is something that seemed like it might have been on the horizon last week in the U.S. Senate. I think senators may have been boosted by the fact that the House looked like it was going to return this week. That is before Speaker Johnson made the decision to leave the House home, to not call them in this week, allow members to stay in their home districts, but also force the Senate to try and reach some sort of solution here to try and pass this House Republican this House Republican passed deal to try and reopen the government. Again, a lot of questions about whether Democrats are willing to kind of head over to the Republican column. Furthermore, Speaker Johnson committing to me last week that he has no plans of putting any sort of bipartisan compromise on the House floor. Take a listen.
The House has done its job. All they have to do is pass the clean continuing resolution, and then we can talk about all this substance. But, I mean, I can't project the future of what would happen.
Are you ruling out putting up a compromise on the floor for a vote if the Senate reaches one?
I am right now because we sent a clean continuing resolution. There's no Republican priorities in the CR at all.
So even if there was a bipartisan compromise to be had, unless, President Trump gets involved or Speaker Johnson has a change of heart, does not seem like any compromise would get a vote in the U.S. House of Representatives, which, of course, is out this week. Now, I just heard the audible buzzes here on the Senate side of the Capitol. That can only mean one thing. The Senate is in. They return this week. The question is, will they be able to reach any sort of agreement? According to the schedule, they're supposed to be out next week. Again, the optics of sending them home in the middle of a shutdown when they're supposed to be working a way out of this government shutdown could be pretty poor. A lot of questions about whether the shutdown lasts another week, whether the fifth attempt to reopen the government has any sort of a different fate than what we saw in previous votes. But at this point, it seems like a shutdown here to stay, at least for now, especially without any sort of seismic agreement here or some sort of a hard-fought concession on behalf of the Democrats.
Nate, I'm sorry, I need to ask you one more question because I totally botched it the first time I tried.
Sure.
I need more coffee. But let's say they come to a compromise and the House, Speaker Johnson says, no, we're not going to vote on that. Then what? We go back to the drawing board?
Yeah.
They have to come up with a new plan or just go back to the original?
Well, look, the reality is they were able to pass that bill, the one they'll be voting on this afternoon for the 5th time, through the House of Representatives. Typically quite difficult to do. Almost no Democrats voted for it. I believe just one House Democrat, Congressman Jared Golden from the state of Maine, voted in favor of that bill. He's a well-known centrist. Again, if the House can kind of maintain this posture of being dug in, they were able to get this bill across the finish line. Of course, they are just one of 2 chambers that make up the legislative branch. But clearly, up to this point, Speaker Johnson seems to be intent on making this a Senate issue, on pushing the ball to the Senate Majority Leader John Thune to basically say, hey, try and get the chamber in line, try and see if you can find any Democrats to support this bill. Already, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican from Georgia, floating that the Senate should get rid of the filibuster, that 60-vote threshold by which the vast majority of legislation is passed, of which, of course, that's part of the reason why they're having trouble getting this bill passed here in the Senate. Congresswoman Greene floating that they should get rid of the filibuster to try and pass this government funding bill. That does not seem likely. That's something that Senate Majority Leader Thune really does not want to do. But look, the talks, the question of how to get out of this logjam, those will just continue as the Senate, as Democrats, Republicans continue to dig in. The Senate, clearly going to take this vote time and time and time again until something changes.
All right. Well, yeah. Thank you for bearing with me on that last question, Scripps News congressional correspondent Nate Reed, live on Capitol Hill for us.
Up next on Today's It Happened.
Space and science advocates descending upon Capitol Hill today with a message for lawmakers. I'm Katie Tubman. Coming up, why they say funding NASA and its science budget has to be a priority and how the U.S. could fall behind in the space race if funding is cut.
Welcome back to Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. All right, let's jump right back into our rundown of our top stories of the day.
Today, hundreds gathered in Washington, D.C. to tell lawmakers to protect NASA and its funding. President Trump's proposed budget would cut billions of dollars from the agency and its science budget. Now, the administration says it's all part of this overall effort to cut back on government waste. Scripps News national correspondent Katie Tubman is following this story. So what do those who came out today say about these cuts, Katie?
Well, Maritza, one spokesperson from a group organizing the event said massive cuts to NASA would result in more waste and that funding the agency is key to keeping the U.S. ahead in space exploration.
Space and science advocates descending upon Capitol Hill Monday to defend NASA and its science budget.
Cuts to NASA science will not make the U.S. stronger. Investing in it will.
The White House has proposed cutting NASA's science budget nearly in half and cutting the agency's overall budget by 24%.
It's an extinction level event, right?
Casey Dreyer is with the nonprofit Planetary Society and says cutting NASA's funding by that amount could have long-term ripple effects.
It cuts research funding across the country. It ends basically all new mission development, so it turns off this pipeline of innovation and economic development.
Both houses of Congress have rejected the White House's proposed cuts, but there are worries the administration could act unilaterally in carrying them out. A former NASA administrator who served under President Trump noted the importance of NASA's science funding during a congressional hearing last month.
The Science Mission Directorate largely is not partisan. It's not political. We need planetary defense. We need the ability to look out in space and see large objects that could really hit Earth and do it damage. And not only that, but we need to be able to intercept those if necessary. And that's what our space program is capable of doing, and it needs to be funded.
Cuts to NASA could put its funding at its lowest level since 1961 and set it back for years to come, says Dreyer.
The future of your nation, the future that your kids will grow up in, will be dimmer. We will have fewer ambitions. This is something that should make the nation proud. And instead of abandoning that and cutting that, we should jointly invest in it and do something that we all can agree on.
Maritza's Monday's event was planned before the government shutdown. NASA has furloughed more than 15,000 employees because of it. Now, Dreyer told us the agency can withstand a few weeks of a shutdown, but beyond that, the disruptions could cause and lead to long-term lasting effects on NASA's working projects. Maritza?
And Katia, if we're talking about people like you and me, what sort of impact does this have for the average person who might like watching a space launch now and then, but isn't really honed in on what NASA is doing every day?
Well, right. Space advocates have an answer for that. They say that NASA and its work ripples throughout the economy. In 2023, NASA says it produced more than $75 billion in economic output and supported more than 300,000 jobs. All of that could be at jeopardy if funding cuts go through. NASA also says it has a great return on investment because it accounts for less than 0.5% of the federal budget. Maritza?
All right, Scripps News national correspondent Katie Tubman, we thank you.
We'll be right back with more of today's top stories on Today As It Happened. Welcome back to Today As It Happened, Scripps News debrief of our top stories of the day. So let's jump right back in.
Listen up, holiday lovers. Spirit Halloween, those pop-up Halloween themed stores across the country figured they'd give Christmas a try. The company says starting early November, they're going to open up 30 new Spirit Christmas stores. Now, some of these stores will take over existing Spirit Halloween stores, and some will be in new locations altogether. In Washington, the Supreme Court today rejecting an appeal from far-right influencer Laura Loomer. This is a big-time Trump ally, and she had filed a suit alleging social media companies violated civil racketeering laws when they yanked her off their platforms back when she ran for a congressional seat in Florida. Loomer was posing the legal question about a law known as Section 230. It protects social media companies from lawsuits over content moderation. Now, both sides of the aisle have shown skepticism about the immunity social media companies enjoy under this law. Now, both X and Meta did not respond to today's Supreme Court decision. And South Carolina state law enforcement confirming today it is investigating what caused a fire that engulfed the home of Circuit Judge Diane Goodstein. The fire happened Saturday afternoon on a remote part of Edisto Island. 3 people were hurt. One had to actually be airlifted out. And as you can see in this video, the home is in a remote area, huge column of smoke there. Rescue teams had to use kayaks to help get people to safety.
The subsidies are so much. It's billions and billions of dollars is being wasted. And we can have a much better health care than we have right now. And we're talking to them. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to happen because this has also been going on, not for 3,000 years, but it's been going on for a long time. But yeah, we're talking to the Democrats.
You would work to make a deal with them on.
I'd like to see a deal made for great health care. Yeah, I want to see great health. I'm a Republican, but I want to see health care much more so than the Democrats.
So, Mr. President, on all of this, as you know, the American people are experiencing a lot of pain with any kind of government shutdown. And while you're dealing with Democrats, and of course Republicans are standing their ground, what is your message directly to the American people who may encounter some of this pain and despair? Yeah. How do you give them hope?
Well, up till now, there hasn't been a great deal of pain.
The government shutdown showdown looks like it's going to go on and on and on. Moments ago, the president addressing the shutdown saying he's talking with Democrats over Obamacare subsidies extensions. Now, Scripps News White House correspondent Jacob Garden-Swartz is live with us now with the latest. So, Jacob, the president was just talking to reporters in the Oval Office and made some news about this shutdown fight. What can you tell us?
Yeah, Maritza, we were just talking last hour about how we hadn't had one of these Oval Office press statements in quite some time. And lo and behold, here we are. And as you noted, the president seemingly contradicting some of what his own White House press secretary had said just a few hours earlier today, suggesting that he is talking directly with Democrats. That's something that Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt had said he was not, that he was focused only on Republican leadership in the House and the Senate. And also, and perhaps most importantly, suggesting that the president is open to some kind of a fix to this Affordable Care Act subsidy cliff. Again, if Congress does not act, millions of Americans will see their health care premiums rise beginning next year when those subsidies for those who receive health insurance through the Obamacare exchanges expires at the end of this year. That is why we are in this shutdown fight that is now stretching into day 6. And for some time, the public line from the White House and from congressional Republicans has been that we will not negotiate on that issue until the government reopens. Well, the president just seemingly shifted tunes a little bit there. Take a listen to what he just said.
If the vote today fails in the Senate, will that trigger layoffs?
It could. At some point it will. And, the Democrats are the ones that started this. And if you think about it, it's about health care.
Would you make a deal with them on the ACA subsidies?
If we made the right deal, I'd make a deal, sure.
Now, on this healthcare question, Republicans not necessarily in lockstep. You have House Speaker Mike Johnson, who has said that he's not interested in extending the healthcare subsidies. You have the Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who has said that he's really deferring to the White House, but that he does not have a lot of interest in at least extending them in their current form. And now you have the president, who admittedly is giving somewhat vague comments as to what type of solution he wants to see for this, but certainly expressing some interest in addressing the situation. how that impacts the broader healthcare fight and the shutdown fight remains to be seen. Senators expected to begin voting on those two competing plans to fund the government that they've already voted 4+ times on. Neither package expected to pass. So this shutdown fight certainly seems poised to continue on, though perhaps a little bit of movement on the White House's side, signaling at least an interest in engaging on the healthcare topic. Maritza?
Yeah, I'll be curious to see how congressional Republican leaders respond to that comment. And I want to ask about this other deal, Jacob. The president talking and addressing what's happening with the Gaza peace deal. What did he say?
Yeah, well, the president, as he was on Friday and over the weekend, really projecting optimism about this peace deal that he and Prime Minister Netanyahu announced at the White House last week. Was at least portions of it were accepted by Hamas on Friday, and now we know that there are Israeli, Palestinian, and U.S. officials in Egypt working through what have been described as technical negotiations.
Incredibly, everyone just came together. They all came together. No, Israel's been great. They've all been good, Caitlin.
And in the negotiations, do you have any red lines in terms of Hamas disarming and whatnot? Are there
No, I have red lines. If certain things aren't met, we're not going to do it. But I think we're doing very well, and I think Hamas has been agreeing to things that are very important.
The president suggesting that, quote, we're going to have a Gaza deal, I'm pretty sure, though as with other administration officials, not necessarily willing to put any sort of timeline as to when he expects that to take place. Again, as we've been reporting all day, among the U.S. officials who are in Egypt participating in these technical conversations are Ambassador Steve Witkoff, who has been really leading the charge for peace negotiations between Israel and Hamas over the past several months, as well as the president's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, someone who does not have any formal role in the government, but who maintains a number of personal and private business interests in the Middle East. The president suggesting that he sees Jared as someone who is highly competent and able to succeed in these negotiations, in these conversations, not giving in to any sort of criticism about the role of a private person essentially participating in these highly sensitive diplomatic conversations. The last thing I'll just mention on this, the president certainly knocking back any suggestion that there is bad blood or distance between himself and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Over the weekend, some reports that the president had grown a little bit frustrated with Netanyahu, suggesting that Netanyahu was always approaching things negatively, not able to join in the positivity that the president feels about this peace deal in particular. The president telling reporters he does not believe that that's the case, that everyone from Israeli officials, Arab leaders of nations surrounding Israel and Gaza, and Palestinian officials themselves all on board with this plan, and now it's just up to those negotiators in Egypt to start hashing out the nitty-gritty details. Maritza?
All right, I know you'll watch for any movement there. Scripps News producer and reporter Jacob Gardenswords live from the White House. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you for joining us this evening for Today As It Happened. I'm Holly Furfer. We hope you have a great Monday night.